In today's macro photography tutorial, I've got a really interesting method to show you guys that will make your still life and abstract shoots a little bit more fun and interesting. Stick around and I'll show you exactly what I mean in just a sec. Hi guys, I'm Ben from Adaptalux and welcome back to another macro photography tutorial where today we're experimenting with a technique that involves half submerging your subject in some water and using the reflections on the surface of the water to create some weird and wonderful landscapes around your subject. Now this can work for some natural subjects and your general still life, but it can also work for some really abstract shots. I've got a couple of subjects that almost look a bit like something from Interstellar or some other sci-fi movie. So depending on your subject, things will change a little bit, but in general, our setup is going to be the same. So let me show you what I've got set up to create some images like these. So let's take a quick look at this shot here and how it's put together. It's actually deceptively simple because all we actually have here is a single light source pointing at a colored backdrop, and our reflective ball is sat half submerged in a bowl of water. Now it's really important that this bowl is black. The surface of the water needs to reflect the color from the backdrop and not show whatever is underneath the surface there. And there is something under the surface. It's just a little lens cap that's holding the ball a little bit higher up in the water. But if it weren't for that reflection on the surface, you would be able to see all of the detail from under the surface of the water. So this is what we're trying to achieve today, is a big colorful reflection on the surface of the water. The next thing that you might notice is that the surface tension of the water is quite high up on that bowl. We're trying to get this bowl as full as possible so that there's no join between the backdrop and the surface of the water. Now obviously there's always going to be a little bit of difference because that reflection is having to travel a little bit further than the light that's bouncing directly off the backdrop. So we're trying to just minimize that. The rest will be done by our depth of field to just blur out the difference between the backdrop and the water. Now, there's a lot that you can do with a setup like this because you can basically submerge anything in this water and have it surrounded by that weird ethereal light. You can change the color of the backdrop, so we have a couple of different backdrop gradient cards out at the moment. You can add more or less light, so I've got a few different lighting arms ready to pop into the Adaptalux Studio, and of course there are options for subjects. The other essential items that you're going to need is a little jug of water so you can top it up a little bit. You also want to have that second plate underneath the bowl to catch any excess water, because as you top it up, it's almost inevitably going to overflow and you generally don't want water everywhere. The next challenge is that this setup is really good for backlighting. It's not quite as good if your object doesn't have an interesting silhouette or reflection. So reflective objects look really cool in a setup like this, non-reflective objects less so, and if it's a simple subject, for example our little rock here, it's not going to look its best. Because we also need to see that writing on the front, if our light is mostly coming from behind, we're really only going to see a silhouetted semicircle of our subject's outline, and that's going to look, well, not quite as fun. So let's take a look at a different subject. I've popped a coin down here in the bowl, and as you can see, with the same backlit setup, it's simply not that interesting, and that's because we're missing light coming from the front of our subject. The ball, it didn't make too much difference because it was spherical and you could see the reflections along the edges of the ball of the backdrop. That gave it a little bit of interest. Our coin here though, it blocks all of the light passing forwards from that backdrop. So we've left ourselves with a pretty boring looking black silhouette. We need to add a little bit of light from the front, and that's exactly what I'm going to do using just a second lighting arm. So I'm going to plug this in, and straight away you're going to be able to see that that makes a huge difference to the look and feel of our coin. You can see that not only is the backdrop now reflected in the water, so is the coin itself. This adds another dimension to how your shot is going to look. You can get really creative with stuff like this and create some really cool reflections on the surface of the water of your subjects half sticking out of the water's surface. I think for something like this coin, it's particularly interesting because it's nautical themed. You can start adding some really cool effects like some additional colors, or like I've done with my blue and red backdrop. It just adds that little theme to your image, which I think is really interesting. Now, I've just adjusted the backdrop a little bit and the angle of my camera to demonstrate the difference that the angle of the camera actually makes. I've moved my camera upwards a little bit, so it's now looking down at a steeper angle, and it's changed a lot about that last photo. You can now see that we have a much more defined edge to the bowl over here, which is not quite as pleasant as it was before, but also you can see the tiny little highlight that is created by the blue tack that is holding the coin in place. That is actually under the water, but because it's not entirely black, you can see it reflected because of this lighting arm. We're now lighting the front of the scene, so any lit item at the front here is going to start reflecting light. If I move this pen underneath the water, you're going to be able to see it in the shot even though it's not above the water. So you do need to be very, very conscious of any light items that are underneath here. You can't see the lens cap because it's black, and you can't see the bowl because it's black. So you do need to be very aware that anything that is underneath the water that might reflect light is going to show up if your camera is high enough. Now, I can completely negate that by moving my camera back down to where it was before. This is the advantage of a really low angle. However, there is an advantage to a really high angle as well, and that is completely removing the back of this bowl entirely. So then guys, as you can see, I've now got another different looking shot. I've moved my camera up to a much higher position so that we can no longer see the back edge of the bowl, but essentially our setup is still the same. We've still got that backlit reflection of the background gradient cards, and we've still got that front light lighting the front of the coin, which is still half submerged. But changing the angle of the camera has changed it so that we no longer have the reflection of the coin, but we do have the reflection of the light. We no longer have the back of the bowl in the frame, so all that we have is that reflection on the surface of the water. This is a really nice effect. It does, however, change the way that our image looks. Obviously, we've only got half of the coin now in the shot, and you can still see a little bit of that blue tack underneath the water. Now, this isn't going to make too much of a difference because the reflection of the coin is no longer in the shot. It's just a nice dark semicircle. We can actually just Photoshop that out. However, I do think that this is another variation on this shoot that could be useful for some of you. So it's a really interesting way to experiment with reflections and light and color, figuring out where you want your reflections to be and what you want your particular shot and subject to look like. The very last thing that we can do with a shot like this is play around with the ripples on the water. As I dip my finger in, you can see that the water ripples really nicely. If you time your shot right, you can get a really cool photo of those ripples affecting all of the reflections that we've worked with so far. This is a really fun way to add even more interest to a shot like this, and people will be curious as to how you achieved that ripply looking background. So I know this has been a really obscure shoots, let's say. It's not the most common type of photography that you're going to be doing, and it's really quite niche when it comes to the types of subjects that you can use with it successfully. But if you do get into backlighting a subject like this and get some really cool abstract shots, or perhaps some nice flower photos with a really unique backdrop and that surface tension all around the petals, well, I'd really like to know. Let me know down in the comments if you try this out. Make sure to hit the like button if you learned something, and make sure to hit subscribe for lots more macro photography tutorials, ideas and inspiration coming in the future. For now, that is all I've got time for. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.